Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event, which is part of the Cambridge Festival. It's one of a number of events taking place over this week, offering a chance to find out about the groundbreaking research that's happening on our doorstep in Cambridge. This afternoon's event is hosted by the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, which is engaged in research and education showing the positive interaction between science and religion, particularly the Christian faith. My name is Keith Fox. I'll be chairing this afternoon, and I'm the director of the Faraday Institute. This afternoon, we'll be looking at the very topical subject of plagues and pandemics from the perspective of science and faith. And this will take the form of a conversation between our two panelists. They are Reverend Dr. Roger Abbott. He is Senior Research Associate in Natural Disasters at the Faraday Institute. And he's carried out projects in Haiti, New Orleans, the Philippines, and a number of other places, exploring the influence of faith belief, people's responses following disasters in those places. He has a PhD in practical theology of disaster response and has been an active responder to traumatic incidents in the UK since 1989. He'll be in conversation with Professor Bob White, who is Professor of Geophysics in the Department of Earth Sciences at Cambridge, and he was a former director of the Faraday Institute. He's led a research group with interests in volcanoes and earthquakes, and needless to say, he is particularly excited about current volcanic events in Iceland. Today, together, they recently edited the book, What Good is God? Crisis, Faith and Resilience, which is available from the bookshop on the Faraday website. They'll be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and we'll follow that with a time of question and answer. So do put your questions in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of the screen. You can do that during the talk itself or during the Q&A session. So without any further ado, let me pass over to Bob and to Roger to talk to us about, and to each other, about plagues and pandemics, perspectives from science and faith.
Thank you, Keith. And hi, Bob. Good to be in conversation with you on this very, very topical issue that affects us all so very, very deeply wherever we are in the world. So it's good to be in conversation, I think. People I meet, whether in research or even in my family, you know, if they're not feeling very well, I say, what's up? And they say, well, I've got a virus, or the doctor says I've got a virus. What is a virus?
Thank you, Roger. Well, if you watch the news, you've had about 365 days of being told about them. But people often didn't know the difference between viruses and bacteria. So that's the first thing. Viruses are not living of their own nature. They're just packages of DNA or RNA. They can't reproduce in the way that bacteria can. And they have to invade a host cell in order to reproduce. So they're not living in that sense unless they can get into a host cell and use the mechanisms of that host to reproduce. And that's really the trouble, because quite often, not always, quite often they destroy that cell in reproducing. As we know, they can be neutralized by the body's own immune system. That's the whole point of vaccination, to boost that immune system. But they've been around really pretty well as long as life has been around on Earth. And many of us will have heard of some of the viruses that have affected humankind. The Spanish flu after the First World War in 1918 killed probably 50 million people. And more recent ones are Ebola and AIDS and SARS and MERS. And the good old common flu, influenza, which in some years, even in England, has killed over 20,000 people in 1 year. Actually, much fewer this last year, because we've all been much more careful with hygiene and we've been isolated. And actually, just before I leave the thing about viruses, what they are, let's say one of the great success stories of science, which is that it eradicated smallpox, which was a particularly vicious virus. It killed 30% of people once you had contracted it. But it's found way back in the 3rd century BC in Egyptian mummies. And even in my lifetime, beginning in the middle of the 20th century, it was killing 300 million people a year. No, about 300 million people in the 20th century, sorry, I think I should say. But it has been eradicated by vaccination. On May the 8th, 1980, officially it was eradicated. I think it's the only vaccine we have eradicated from the system. So I think that's a brief overview.
Thank you very much. So I mean, from what you've said, there's some pretty bad things associated with viruses. But are they always bad, and are they all bad?
No, they're not all bad. Many animals have them. They allow them in their bodies because they are really good at killing bacteria, and so they'll carry the overhead, if you like, of allowing viruses to reproduce inside them because they do the greater good of killing bacteria. So they're good in the right place. And in fact, even people, humans, scientists are trying to use them to make things called bacteriophages, purposefully using viruses to try and attack some of these superbugs that are so hard to eradicate because antibacterials can't reach them. And let me just tell you one other really good thing, really important thing for us as humans, is that humans have co-opted, as mammals have, they've co-opted viruses to allow the development of a placenta. So if it weren't for viruses, we wouldn't be able to reproduce in the way we do through a placenta. And in fact, about 8% of the human genome is viral inserts. So we don't know what they all do at the moment. So yes, in the right place, they're good. What's gone wrong now, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that they're in the wrong place. But Roger, let me ask you, you've trained as a pastor, you've worked in trauma relief a lot. What perspective does your work put on viruses?
Well, that's an interesting question. As a theologian, I thought it was so interesting reading recently when in the year 2000, I think it was, celebrating the completion of the Human Genome Project, the former US President Bill Clinton said this, and I quote, "We are learning the language in which God created life." And he said other things. And what he was talking about was the beauty and the complexity of the human genome. And I found myself very happily as a theologian echoing Clinton's words. I think Francis Collins actually helped him in forming that. But I certainly echo it because I think viruses, the more I look at them, at least from a theological perspective and a limited scientific perspective, I think they're fascinating. They're absolutely fascinating. And I must be careful here because I want to distinguish between the virus, which I think is absolutely fascinating, and any associated diseases, which are obviously hugely horrible, and the current one in particular. But as non-living packages, as you've just said, viruses, it seems to me, just do what viruses do. And what they do is, as these non-living chemical packages, they love to replicate, and they'll do that wherever they find the opportunity to do it. And particularly important, I think, for the current virus, is that this kind of virus loves to jump. And again, of particular interest to me is the routes of transmission, how and where it jumps. And we all know it jumps from human to human because that's what we're all trying to curb at the present time. But how did it get into the human is the thing that interests me. And there again, I think we need to come back and look very carefully at a route of transmission from habitats where it seems to exist without any great problems, namely in wildlife. And then it jumps into the human, usually via an intermediary animal of some sort. But once it gets into us, it's very distressing, as anyone who's had the disease will know. And it sort of sends a signal to us, or we send a signal to it. Listen, virus, you don't belong here. I don't want you here. And the virus says the same. I want to be there because I'm doing what I'm designed to do. And so we get these horrible symptoms when we get the disease, which eventually affect us, and we feel so rotten. And really, those symptoms are the products not just of the virus, but mainly of our own bodies saying to the virus, as it were, you don't belong here, so just go away. And the virus says, but I want to be here. And so there's this battle that takes place between the virus and our own immune system and antibodies. And so I think it's an absolutely fascinating way of working, a very fascinating whole area that I find. And I'm very reluctant to say that it is all bad. It's fascinating, but there are human aspects to this that I think we really need to look at very, very carefully.
Yes, well, of course, the current pandemic, although it's consuming the whole world, of course, isn't the first time the world has faced devastating plagues or pandemics. And I talked about the 1918 flu. Well, what stopped that in the end was it just mutated itself to be inefficient in spreading, and it died out naturally. There isn't any sign of the COVID-19, the virus that causes that, doing the same thing at the moment anyway. But we've probably all heard of the Black Death, which actually was bacterial bubonic plague in the mid 14th century. That killed up to 200 million people. It's a bit uncertain, 75 to 200 million people in the Afro-Eurasian area. And of course, the world's population was smaller then, so it was huge. Huge percentage of the population. And there have been many waves of plagues like that. And in fact, we also wanted to look at religious aspects, didn't we, in this chat? And it's really interesting. There was a plague in the 3rd century in the Roman Empire when it was spreading right throughout the Mediterranean and around, when there was a Christian bishop called Bishop Cyprian, who wrote a very famous sermon, which you can still look up actually on Google, amazingly.
I've read it.
Yes, amazing, because it's from the 3rd century. And he urged Christians to stay in Carthage, which is where he lived, to help the dying, whereas everybody else was hurtling away as fast as they could, often leaving their relatives ill behind because they were so terrified of the plague. And this actually was despite the fact that Cyprian had been persecuted in previous decades, so he wasn't a popular figure really. But the interesting thing is that afterwards, it's actually known quite often as the Cyprian plague now because of what he did. And afterwards, a lot of people actually became Christians. So it was a real revival of Christianity because they saw what those Christians were doing, that they stayed behind, often at the cost of their own lives, in fact, because of course they died as well, to help others. And I think that's an intriguing religious aspect. And of course, we know there's enormous goodwill responses at the moment by all sorts of people to the current pandemic. But I think this aspect of words speaking, action speaking much louder than words is a crucial aspect, isn't it, of how we respond to things. If you have a religious faith, then if your actions don't fit with your faith, then that sort of belies the reality of the faith, doesn't it? But Roger, I wanted to ask you, because I know you're trained as a first responder to disasters, aren't you? And I know you were at the Grenfell Tower disaster shortly after that, the fire there. You're at the Manchester bombing and other disasters as well. Now, they aren't pandemics, of course, so they have a different flavor, if you like, different character. But I wonder if there's lessons to be learned from those disasters to help us in our response to pandemics and maybe in planning for the next pandemic, because there will be another one, almost certainly.
Sure. I was asked to give a presentation to some members of Cornwall County Council, actually, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I put my head on the block and said that the problem with you emergency planners is that you never learn. And I drew attention to some tragedies that had taken place in Cornwall, mainly maritime ones, and as well as to more up-to-date ones, because this is a problem. Emergency planning in the UK or anywhere actually is very, very notoriously difficult.
Did they have a plan for pandemics, Roger? Was there any?
Well, well, back in 2009, there was the H1N1 swine flu, which was registered as a pandemic. It was number one on the pandemic risk register. And I was attending some of those meetings in the local authority here with the local resilience forum. And all the talk was about flu and pandemics. So yes, there have. But I think the point I want to make is viruses are very difficult to plan for because they're different and they mutate, as we're finding. And we have these variants popping up, Brazil, Kent, South Africa, and so on. So it isn't an easy issue, and I don't want to give that impression. But having said that, it is possible using past data and learning from previous incidents, disease-related incidents in particular, to develop general guidelines. And I remember a year ago, just about now, picking up Laura Swinney's book on the Spanish flu pandemic, Pale Rider it's called. And obviously she was referring to what was happening in 1918. Her book was published in 2017, so it didn't have the present pandemic in mind. But as I was reading it and reading her reflections on it, I thought she's talking about now as well as then in terms of the lessons that were being learned from the Spanish flu. But as you've already mentioned, there have been other pandemics. There's the HIV, particularly in Africa, but it spread to other places. We had SARS in the Far East in 2002, 2003. We had MERS in Saudi Arabia in 2011. And it's interesting, Bob, that those countries at the present who seem to be dealing with the pandemic most successfully, namely Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Vietnam, and South Africa, they've all drawn lessons from these past pandemics. And they've learned very quickly, for instance, that you have to lock down, and you have to lock down tight, which of course isn't very popular, of course, even less popular now, but that's the way they did it. And not only did they lock down tight, they implemented, as soon as they could, the test, track, and trace. They had that in place almost immediately and very effectively. And not only that, they learned the lessons which the developing world has shown to us for a long time, the importance of local communities being involved. And we've not done that. We've only done it very, very late. We locked down late. And our test, track, and trace is still stumbling along, to be honest. And we have a very centralist way of doing things.
Yeah.
So
well, next time, maybe we'll have a memory of that. I find it intriguing that all through history, really, the main response to plagues and pandemics has been to lock yourself away. I think of that village in Derbyshire, Eyam, where they actually chose to isolate themselves.
Right.
And you know, many of them died, but they didn't spread the plague onto others. And here in the 21st century, isn't it amazing that the most effective answer we've got is still isolation, which is so it's counter-human because we live in relationship with others. We live in community. Now we might maybe we'll come and talk about vaccines a bit later on, which might help us through that.
But you mentioned the bombings, the Manchester bombing and the Grenfell Tower fight. Now, what despairs me is there have been inquiries into both of those, as there are inevitably into major incidents when they happen in the UK, and the reports will be written about those, and they will come out with recommendations as they were. Now, the mistakes made in the Manchester bombings, particularly with respect to the way the emergency services responded or delayed, and the whole debacle of the Grenfell fire, is drawing to our attention lessons that were in the domain, if you like, of emergency planning and public domain, but just we did not learn, and that is the point, I think, that at times gives me great hesitation about how quickly we will come out of this pandemic. We do need to learn. Yeah,
indeed. I mean, one thing that I find interesting about the present pandemic, compared to ones previously through the history of humankind, really, is that it spreads so fast. I mean, it literally spreads at the speed of a jet airliner, doesn't it? And it's literally spread around the world in days, whereas in the 14th century, it would spread at the speed of a horse and cart. So that's one thing, which means we really need a global response. You know, unless you lock yourself away in an island and never ever interact with anybody else at all, we have to be a global response. The other thing that's perhaps been particularly difficult about this pandemic is that often people can spread it without having symptoms, the so-called asymptomatic infection. So you don't even know that you're infecting other people. And that makes it really hard to control, doesn't it?
Sure.
And one of the striking things, I guess, most of these sort of pandemics affect the very old, and we're used to that, but also the very young. The very young are usually very vulnerable. But in this case, it hasn't been what's happened. It's really the old people who've been dying, although it's often people with other comorbidities, things that don't help them in their response. So I think that's a very striking thing, and it's obviously something society is thinking about a lot, the way we've perhaps let down some of our older people. And you know, and it's part of the development of society that so many older people are not living with their families anymore in the way they would have until the last century, really. Something else that I wanted to ask you about is that there has been some discussion that the fact that this has affected the whole of Britain, the whole of the world, is the whole mental health issue and the whole risk of mass trauma or collective trauma, if you like. That a whole lot of people have been traumatized on the same time frame. There's been huge amounts of bereavement in the same time frame. And I know you've been conducting interviews for many months now with people to talk about their responses to COVID-19. And also, I think you've been investigating long COVID. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, Roger.
Yeah. First of all, on the matter of the mass trauma, there's been recent publications about this being a distinct possibility. And that is when a large number of people are traumatized in a shared time frame. And then the whole impact of mass bereavement. I personally, I think the jury is still out on that. A huge amount of attention is being given at the moment in the media to tsunamis of mental health issues. And I don't want to trivialize or minimize those, but certainly in my own work and own research with traumatic incidents, one thing that's come across to me very powerfully is the human being's capacity for self-repair and the whole issue of what's being called post-traumatic empowerment. And there is that capability. And I think the key to that is something we'll talk about probably a bit later, and that is the strength of the community. That's a well-known resource for resilience in times of emergency and times of crisis. The issue of long COVID, I think, is a very interesting one. I'm actually keeping I have a participant who is sharing with me their diary, which they started to compose back in September, and I get sort of weekly updates on how things are going. And this is a middle-aged guy, fit. And what is so clear to this is that long COVID is the sort of resistance movement of the disease. It's what's going on in the background, which people can easily forget. That it isn't just what's going on at the coal face, so to speak. It's what's going to happen as people so-called try to recover. And what we're finding out is, and this affects people of various ages, is this thing called long COVID, because the disease itself, of course, affects the lungs, deep into the lungs. It affects the heart, it can affect the brain, it can affect the nervous system. We have this problem with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a very, very debilitating syndrome that COVID can leave people with. And certainly from tracing the person that I'm working with on this, long COVID is not a good thing. It's not a pleasant thing. It ruins. You can't plan, because every day can be different. You can feel happy and able to take on the world one day, and the next day it's a great kick in the teeth and you feel absolutely wretched. It's so random. And it really is going to be a serious health issue that will impact on global healthcare services, I think, for many years. It will affect people's working capacity, their mental health, and most of all, I think it runs a danger of striking at people's hope. And if you haven't got hope in a time like this, you really are in trouble.
Well, that's been a bit of a gloomy discussion, and
Sorry.
You're quite right to draw attention to it. But I'm a scientist, and let me just celebrate really the triumph of science in making so many vaccines. And it's not just one, you know, there's many of them now coming to market. They've been produced incredibly well, and they're much more effective than anybody that was working on them ever expected. You know, efficacy of 70, 80, 90, 95% is astonishing, you know. And I think this is an amazing thing that we should celebrate, actually. That vaccination is such a good thing. And I mean, from my Christian perspective, I actually think that science is a gift of God, you know. How people can ever think that religion and science should be opposed to one another, I just can't understand, because here we are using, you know, the created world to make something which is good for humankind. So I think we should really celebrate the vaccines, and I think that's one of the things that's going to get us out of this isolation. I was very struck by your comment about community being so important in resilience as well, because one of the things I've noticed, we live in a street with fairly big houses, so we're all driving to our own drives, and we just don't see each other, to be honest, and we're all very, very busy all the time, rushing out to work and coming back again and doing all the other things we do. And actually this pandemic has really drawn out the importance of community. That, you know, there's a WhatsApp group down our street, like there are in many, many streets. You know, somebody will say, how you doing? I'm going shopping. Anybody want anything? You know, can I come and fix your windows or something, because I noticed it got broken. I mean, this is an amazing response. And I think it is, hopefully this is one of the things that will continue on after the pandemic, this real sense that community is so important, because of course it is at the root of human societies, human sociability. We're made to be in relation with one another. That's how we're made. We're not meant to be individuals, each on our own. But let's get back to vaccines, because one of the issues that comes up, perhaps actually not so much in Britain as in other countries, particularly France, for instance, is there's quite a significant minority of people with what's called vaccine hesitancy. You know, they're not sure about taking it. And I'd like to ask you to explain what you found, because I know you've been interviewing people, and I think probably some of those people have vaccine hesitancy, don't they? And the reason it's important, I mean, if they don't want to get vaccinated, that's okay, of course, because they have freedom to do whatever they want, but within the law. But one of the mantras that's often repeated is that until everyone's safe, nobody's safe. The vaccination doesn't just help you; it helps everybody else, because it helps prevent the spread and the growth of the virus, amongst others. So, what have you found out about vaccine hesitancy, Roger?
Well, I like to distinguish vaccine hesitancy from anti-vaxxers. I have little sympathy with the latter. I have enormous sympathy, I must admit, with the former. It was interesting reading some academic journals recently, and one of them, the authors were saying, well, and it was a SAGE author, so one of the SAGE members, and he said, well, all of us are hesitants. We all have vaccine hesitancy because they have to make the decisions, as it were. They have huge responsibility on their shoulders. So I think vaccine hesitancy is good. I think there's a good aspect to it. My particular concern is with the Black community, where vaccine hesitancy is more marked. I think it's only about 30% of the Black community that is having the vaccine. And that is concerning, because we know that Black, Asian, and the multi-ethnic communities can be more susceptible to the disease. So I've spoken to a number of Black community members, participants, and interestingly, some of those have no hesitation at all. I was talking to one yesterday, no hesitation at all, partly because she wanted to see her grandson.
So why do some people have that hesitancy, particularly since, for whatever reason, the BAME community seem to be more vulnerable to
yes, it's the Black and the Bangladeshi communities that are the most prominent in this. And someone referred to that. I had an interview with one of the prominent Black community leaders, and he speaks about the dust of history. And there's an awful lot of that dust in terms of the history of the African slave trade, and then the resultant histories of Black repression and the way the Black people have been treated. And it's very difficult for us as white people to actually feel that there is something in that, but there really is. And I think we in our communities have to learn this, and we have to be very, very careful. We can encourage people to have the vaccine. Clearly, we can't force them. We can help them address the issues, and I think that comes down best to the work of community health workers and community leaders, faith leaders included, who can be involved in that. But I do think we need to be patient, and we need to be sensitive that there is a real basis to vaccine hesitancy.
Thank you. I guess we've only got not so many minutes left, maybe 10 minutes. So I would like to move on to the effect of religion, as in the title, but perhaps there's just one thing I'd like to say first, which is that actually climate change is arguably a much bigger problem in the medium and long term than even COVID-19. And they have a lot of things in common, actually, because it's quite clear that it's the poor and the disadvantaged who suffer most from the effects of climate change. You know, those of us who have benefited from burning fossil fuels for a century are the rich people. We can just buy ourselves out of problems. But if you're living on the breadline, that's not so easy, or even not possible sometimes. And I think there's an intriguing connection here, actually, which other people have noticed as well, between climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, which actually, because we're squeezing wild animals into smaller and smaller places, we're just encroaching on their habitat, and we're living much closer to them. And of course, in some places, we're eating wild meat as well, bringing animals which never would be normally together into these wild meat markets next door to each other. That it's made it much easier to do what you were talking about at the beginning, for the virus to jump into humans, place there, you know, which is so dangerous to us, rather than staying within the animal population where they're tolerated and they even do some good to some of the animals. So I did just, we're not going to talk about climate change particularly, but I think it is a bigger issue, and I hope that we don't forget about it when we get through this pandemic. And it's very intriguing that, you know, 2 years ago, you would have heard people saying, well, if you could treat it on a war footing, climate change, you know, we really do something about it. It's not that hard to do things about a lot of the issues. And here we are in a pandemic, we are treating it on a war footing. We're taking away liberties of people. We're imposing central mandates on people. We've spent more money than we ever have going into debt since the last war. So, well, that's my little rant about climate change, but it's not just a rant, but because I think it is a big issue, and I hope we don't forget about it as we come through this. And it has connections to this pandemic, and maybe more in the future if we're not very careful. But I would like to move on to the role of religion, because that was always also advertised. And I mentioned about the way that Christians perhaps provided care and succor while others were fleeing in that Cyprian plague. But I know some forms of religion can be problematic, can't they? I wondered if you could amplify that a bit, Roger, the ways in which they might be problematic when dealing with pandemics, because I think your interviews have been specifically with people who have religious faith, or maybe even just with Christians, are they?
Mainly with Christians, yeah.
Yeah, with Christians. So I think, you know, you have an angle on this, I think, which perhaps isn't.
Yeah, and yes, it can be problematic, but it's only problematic when, if you like, the religion behaves and thinks dysfunctionally, if I may put it in that way. I mean, we had an example with due respect, most recently, affecting the president of Tanzania. Now, here's a man a leader, a very charismatic leader, who had triumphed the sort of opening of life in Tanzania, claiming, you know, it wasn't the virus wasn't a real issue. Well, of course, he tragically took sick and died of it last week, I think it was.
Oh, really? Gosh.
So this whole issue, and it has to be said as well that religious groups have tapped into the issue of vaccine hesitancy, sometimes to try to persuade people not to have the vaccine. I mean, I have people I know who've tried this, sadly, and
How does religion feed into that then, Roger? Can you just explain why?
It feeds in a bizarre way. I think it's a mixture, actually, of sometimes personality disorder, if I may be so bold, but also tapping into particular views of the end times, if you like. That in the end times there's going to be a sort of revival, not just of the gospel and of the good news, but also of satanic activity and this kind of thing, the kind of spiritual demonic activity, which then feeds into the whole idea of the conspiracy, that there's a big ideology at the back of this that is being spiritually implemented, if you like, and manipulated. And I think that that can be very, very damaging. And I think that has to be, because it has to be contrasted with, and sometimes you see this in the same person. I mean, I've known people who are anti-vaxxers, but who are helping in food banks, helping in the community. You know, we're a strange mix. And there is a huge amount I'm finding coming out in my interviews of very positive contributions. Pastoral care, for instance. I think there's a resource that the community could tap into. You know, you have people with experience of helping people, dealing with people in their struggles. And I just know that there are those in the churches who would be very willing to be useful, more useful in the community than they are being, because of the secular religious divide that we seem to be dominated with.
Actually, I seem to remember. Well, you're a registered reverend,
Yes.
and
Sorry.
you worked in. Well, you wanted to go and work in hospitals, didn't you? But you weren't able to during the beginning of the pandemic.
At the beginning of the pandemic, you remember there was this call for volunteers.
Yeah.
It just so happens when I was doing my PhD back in 2006 and onwards, I volunteered as a chaplain in a local NHS hospital, a very busy and important NHS hospital, and I worked in the emergency department and loved it. So I thought, well, I'll try this again, and it didn't come off. I'm not sure why, but it didn't come off. But it was a very interesting time, Bob, because I had to think through very carefully there the implications of volunteering into an emergency situation, whether it be in the emergency department or in the ICUs and so on, of catching it myself. I'm in the age range, dare I say, of vulnerability.
Actually, I think we both are, Roger, I'm afraid to say.
So, you know, and I have a wife, I have 5 children, I have 12 grandchildren, and I really had to think that through very, very carefully. But it wasn't that I decided not to do it. It was the system just wouldn't work with it for some reason.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, that the challenges this pandemic confronts us with, actually, a lot of the issues are religious issues, if you like, issues of how we live our lives, aren't they? We've talked about the importance of community and of care for others, which is central to the Christian faith and many other faiths as well, of course. And fortunately, as you said, crisis tends to pull us together. It also, interestingly, has confronted us with death, the issue of death, which big time, but it's an issue that we don't talk about, or we haven't hitherto. We don't even talk about people dying. We talk of them moving on or passing on because we don't like to think about it, I guess. And even in my case, you know, I didn't see a dead person until I saw my mother after she'd died when I was already about 60 years old. Now, this is quite abnormal in the history of humankind, where you would have been confronted with it daily, more or less, and people would have lived with you and died. So I think actually a positive aspect of the pandemic and of the role of religion is that we sort of have permission to speak into this issue now, don't we? Have permission to talk about it because it's facing each one of us. You know, it's there on the horizon, and if not us, it's our friends or our relatives, and there can be very few people that don't know someone who's died with COVID at the moment. The other thing I think that
I wish we would talk about it more. You know, talking with some of my participants who are in hospital chaplains and just listening to the things that they've had to deal with. I mean, you know, relatives weren't able to be with their loved ones, you know, when they died, but chaplains were.
Yes.
Along with nursing staff, of course. And I think these have done a really, really valiant work. It's hard to underestimate the value that they have. And a number of the chaplains have said how the whole NHS system, which at times has been quite suspicious about chaplaincy, it's a low budget part of the NHS, have now come to realize how important it is.
Mm.
But the whole issue, I think, of just talking, I mean, death is it's part of life. It's 100% success rate. So, and it's our hope. This is the thing. I think people don't talk about death because they're not sure what hope there is. But of
Yes.
course, from a Christian perspective, there's enormous hope.
Yes, I was going to say a lot of the things we've talked about today, community spirit, care for others, food banks, looking out for people, all this sort of thing. Well, that's many people would do that. I think it's a distinctive difference, isn't it, with religious faith, particularly with Christianity. There is hope for the future. And as you said, if you don't have that hope, it's devastating. I can barely imagine living without some hope for the future. So it's a crucial part of how we move forward. How do you think we make that clear, really? Because we live in an age of great individualism, don't we? Where what I do is what matters to me, and that's a fulfilled life. Does it give a fulfilled life? What's your take on say the Christian hope?
It's interesting. A pastor messaged me this week, and we were talking about trauma. And he said, well, what do you recommend to get us talking about trauma? Because trauma is something by definition that tends to silence people. And I think we come back to community again. And this was a matter of life up until the 20th century, really. The community talked about dying. Families talked about dying. People died at home with their families. And there was quite a different approach to death until now we have a medical system and an emergency system which corrals death off from life.
Yes.
You're separated. You're not allowed to see it. You're not allowed to be there very often. And I think that's very, very socially dangerous, very psychologically dangerous. So I think one of the things that faith communities can do is talk about it more themselves. And then hopefully that'll catch on.
I think I might give you the last word on this, and then we'll take some questions. But we've talked about hope for the future. Could you just explain what the Christian hope for the future is? What, is it just that we'll get out of the pandemic and things will be fine, or what? Can you just amplify the Christian hope for
my perspective?
That would be helpful.
Christian. And I asked this question to my participants as well about hope and going back to normal or the new normal. And hardly anyone thinks we'll go back to normal because too much has happened. And a number of people are saying, well, there needs to be a new normal. And I think my hope is that we will learn from this pandemic. It's a huge learning curve. So much to be learned about how to live, about relationships, how we get on with each other, how we treat each other, how we deal with the issues of social justice, whether it's race, gender, or whatever. So I really hope we will learn from that. But then I said to somebody yesterday I was interviewing, I said, well, what if you catch the disease? And they said initially, well, I just hope I'll get over it. I said, what if you don't? And I think that's the crunch. And for me, as a Christian, and I had to think all this through as I was going through that time preparing for volunteering, my hope is in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who came into this world to give me hope and to pave the way for eternal life. Because he is risen and I trust him, then I believe I will rise with him. And then a new heaven, a new earth, where whether there'll be viruses there, perhaps there will, but there won't be disease.
The viruses won't hurt anybody. I investigate I study volcanoes, and I think in in the new creation, there'll be great volcanoes, there'll be great spectator events, you know, better than any fireworks, but they won't hurt anybody.
Sure.
Roger, thank you so much
Thank you,
for this
Bob.
conversation. Shall we hand back to our chairman? And I think
Indeed.
there may be some questions that well, we can listen to. I don't know if we can answer, but Keith, over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and Roger. Thank you for setting our conversation going and for putting some ideas in people's minds. There's a number of questions come in, some of a sort of more medical, virological nature and some of a theological one. We closed on more sort of theological issues. So I wonder if we can maybe pick up on some of the faith aspects of this. I mean, a very simple question that's been put twice really is, where is God in all this? What is God doing about the pandemic?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I mean, I think one thing which is a great gift of God is the ability to do science, the ability that, you know, if you believe in a creator God and you believe that we're living in his creation, as I do as a Christian, then I think it's one of his great gifts to us that we can do science, that this is an intelligible world. There's no particular reason it should have been that way, but it is. And because we're made in the image of God, I think he wants us to understand this world and use it for the good of humankind. You know, the very oldest scientific organization in the world, the Royal Society, when it was founded, it had two main reasons, it says in its charter. One is for the glory of God, which is what they would have said in the 17th century anyway. But one is for the good of humankind, to understand the world for the good of humankind. So that's one place I think God is very clear, is in so many vaccines that are all working so effectively. So I think science, I'm a scientist, but then I think that's one of the great gifts from God. Roger, do you have?
Yeah, I think we mustn't forget the fact that there is a moral aspect to the pandemic, you know, perhaps unconsciously, the way we treat each other, the way we make conclusions about justice and injustice. And you think, well, these only have meaning, really, if there is a creator, if there is a creator God. And we've spoken so much about the good that comes, is being seen at the moment. And I think, you know, where does that come from? Is that just a human thing? Why should it be a human thing? This self-denial, this commitment of not just religious people, but even those with no religion. So I think if we look at the pandemic in the round, we can find a whole vista of where God is.
Can I turn the question around the other way? So we've asked, where is God in that? What about people's responses to God through this? Maybe Roger particularly, and the other trauma work that you've done. Have this caused people to question their faith, or in some strange way has that strengthened the faith of those who are Christian believers?
That's a good question, actually, because very often people will assume that in times of great distress and struggle, then people will, you know, despair of themselves, of their own resources, and that they'll turn to God. And in one sense, I think of what I experienced in Haiti, but also in each of the catastrophic disasters that I've researched, that kind of thing happened. That kind of thing happened almost instantaneously. It was almost an impulse. But once people realized that life could settle back down to normal again, then they reverted to type. And certainly the research seems to indicate that it isn't these crises that actually provoke people to faith. It's those people who have a pre-existing faith who find it easiest and find they have the best resources to deal with the situation when it does come. It tends to be in that way. And certainly in the church leaders that I've interviewed, I've asked them the question, you know, did you find that your congregation swelled as a result of this, and particularly because they were virtual congregations as well. And they said, well, initially they did, but then after a few weeks they tailed off, and it's been a great opportunity for churches to tell people about hope and about God and faith. Whether it results in more people coming to faith, I think the jury is out.
I don't think we can. I mean, often we don't know why things happen, and I think the expectation that we can explain why God has allowed something to happen is just so off beam that, you know, because I'm not God and He is. And it seems to me that when you read that amazing book of the Bible by Job, if you've ever read that, probably one of the oldest books in the Bible, who suffered immensely. He suffered enormously, but he trusted God. And at the end of the day, he just wanted to know why God had allowed it. It's a very human response. Why me? You know, why is this happening? It's what we all say. And in the end, God just spends 3 chapters talking about his amazing creation, you know, from the origin of the universe to the tiniest little finding food for the chicks of the ravens and so on. And in the end, Job just says, okay, yeah, you're God and I'm not. And I think it's a quite proper response, actually, that we're not God, we don't understand, but we can trust him because he's good and he's loving. And I think probably that's what's coming through in these people who've experienced disasters, that they don't know why it happened to them, but they have a sort of a fundamental faith that God is sovereign over it, and so he is, if you like, in control of it. At least he's sovereign of it, and they can trust that because they've trusted that all their lives, and that actually gives them a resilience, as Roger said, and a strength to come through it in a way that is very difficult if you don't start off with that religious faith.
Maybe I can follow on from that one with a question. I'm sure you're going to say there is no answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Somebody commented they listened to Richard Dawkins on the radio this morning. I think it's his 80th birthday, asserting that viruses attack us because they are programmed to survive at our expense. Does this imply that God preordained their purpose? And if yes, how can we square that with a loving God?
I mean,
scientist or a theologian want to take that one?
Yeah, we've talked about this a little bit already. I mean, there's lots of things that are good in the right context and are bad outside of it, aren't there? You know, sex is good, I think, but rape is terrible. You know, it's the same physical act. I think there are physical things which are good in the right context. Nuclear energy is very helpful, but nuclear bombs are terrible. And so I think it's a matter of the right things in the right place, isn't it? And that's true of viruses as much as anything else, I think. What do you think, Roger?
I think that's very important. I think you put your finger on it when you said it's a matter, it's not a black and white issue. As we've said in our conversation, a virus in the right place doesn't cause harm. It can cause good. If it's in the wrong place, then yeah, it can be catastrophic. And that's why I think we have to take seriously, and I'm not sure we are doing it at the moment, we have to take seriously about routes of transmission. How and why does the virus jump from, for instance, its natural reservoir in wildlife into human beings? And that route, it can be very empirically, I think, demonstrated to be down to human error and human culpability, and basically human greed.
Thank you. Maybe I can just change tack a little bit. And you talked towards the end about death being seen as a taboo subject in our culture. We don't talk about it. It's perceived as being defeat, not least by the medical profession. How can we address that sense of death as the inevitable defeat that will happen to all of us?
Well, I guess if we're scientists, then we've got the evidence fair and square in front of us, unless we're of the illusion that one day we shall be able to eliminate death from a medical point of view. And I don't think, well, I'm pretty sure we won't. There is, it has to be said, quite a move now within within certain circles for people to be both in the clinical professions and in the hospice movement, for people to be encouraged to talk about death and realize its inevitability. And then, of course, you have to work out, well, how are you going to come to terms with that? Because if we don't, then we're quite frankly just putting our heads in the sand and saying, well, it doesn't have to be inevitable. It does. And we have to come to terms with that. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges that our sophisticated, technological, and at times very arrogant attitude to life really has to think again and think very carefully.
Thank you. Can I just give a little anecdote about a dinner I had with somebody once? He'd won the Nobel Prize for discovering something called apoptosis. Well, Keith's a biologist, so this is a way that your own cells are programmed to die when they get old and they get errors in them and so on, that actually it's quite a good thing for them to die to help your body. And I said, how on ever did you think of that idea? He said, well, it's interesting. He was a Methodist, he was a Christian. He said, I was walking home one day and I was thinking that, you know, death is not the end for a Christian. It's the beginning, in a way, of a life with God. And I thought, well, this isn't all bad. And then he started thinking about his cell biology and thought, yeah, well, maybe that's why cells kill themselves. You know, they actually purposefully eliminate themselves to make way for others. It's not answered the main question about humans, because, of course, Jesus said death is the final enemy, but I've overcome it. So I think there's a Christian response to it, but there's an interesting scientific response from that anecdote as well.
Thank you. Our time is moving on, so I'm going to give one last question, I think. There are other ones that we could deal with. And that is how we're going to exit from this, and how churches and institutions particularly are going to recover. Churches have been, as institutions, have shut their doors for months. We've been absent from many pressing concerns. Can they, as institutions and communities, recover a central role in human life?
I think this is very interesting, actually, because I remember when, again, a year ago, when there was a lot of sort of posting on social media and so on, the church has closed. In fact, the church hasn't closed. Church buildings closed, and quite rightly so, in my view, at that time. But the church didn't close, because the church is people. The church is a community of people. And in fact, that community has continued to operate, all right, within restrictions. Now, it's very interesting reading the material that churches are producing, church leaders are producing, and theologians are producing, that they're now thinking very carefully about what to learn from the practices, as it were, of the last year, about how church can continue and how it should continue. And one thing the church seems to be doing very much at the moment is looking very carefully at this and looking at a ways forward. What can we learn from hybrid, putting on continuing hybrid services, a mixture of live and virtual? There's a whole raft of things that the church has been doing and will continue to do. So I don't think the church will necessarily suffer from this. It doesn't have to. It can, in fact, and as Bob has indicated, historically, actually thrived after such a time as this. And that possibility could happen again. So I don't look with pessimism on the future. I think we have to be careful. I think we have to be wise, but we don't have to lose hope.
Thank you, Roger. Bob, do you want to give one last comment on that, or are we done?
No, I'll leave it to Roger. He's a reverend, you know.
Well, thank you both very much for your conversation today. I think we could go on for a long time, but our time is up, and people have probably got other things that they need to get back to. So we thank you both very much. Obviously, if we were in person, there would be a round of applause. But I'll give you a virtual applause anyway, at least from the quiet of my room.
Thank you.
So thank you ever so much for the conversation. I'm sure people want to carry on with those thoughts. I'm sure, Roger, you'd love to hear people's thoughts.
Yes, indeed. Do please
etc.
send them through.
Can I remind people of the book that Roger and Bob have edited? What Good is God? Crises, Faith and Resilience is there on the Faraday bookshop. I'm sure Bob and Roger would be only too delighted to see more sales of that.
It's very cheap as well, I have to say, from the Faraday shop, because we sell them at cost price.
That's quite correct, yes. And you'll also find, for everybody listening, in the chat, is that we'll just put a link to a short survey from the Cambridge Festival itself. It'll help with next year's festival. If you can click on the link there, it's in the chat. It's about 3 or 4 chats up now, and be very helpful to fill in that so that the Cambridge Festival can get an idea of what works and what doesn't work. So thank you very much again for being with us, for your questions, Bob, and to Roger writing our thoughts. We will say goodbye and thank you. I think some resources will go past if you want to take a note of some of the things the Faraday Institute is doing. But other than that, thank you for being with us this afternoon, and goodbye.
Thank you,
for
Bob.
the chat.
Good to be with you.
You too.
Bye-bye now.